If you're familiar with me, you may know that Dianne Wiest is my favorite actress.
Somebody has to like me best.
However, I have not seen all of her films. I kind of have a goal, I guess you could call it a New Year's resolution, to see the rest of her films this year. So what I'm going to do later on is make little check-in videos where I tell you what I've seen, rather than make every month a Dianne Wiest episode of Watchlist Wednesday. Let Them All Talk is a film that came out in 2020, and it was kind of an experiment by Steven Soderbergh. He basically put three legendary actresses on a cruise ship headed to England. He used as little artificial lighting as possible, minimal equipment. The rumor that's going around is that the film was not scripted or was largely improvised. According to Soderbergh and the screenwriter, that is not the case. So celebrated author Alice Hughes, who's played by Meryl Streep, is receiving a prestigious literary award in England. However, she refuses to fly, so they make arrangements for her to go on a cruise ship. To keep her company on this trip, she invites two of her oldest, and we get the feeling slightly estranged, friends, who are played by Candice Bergen and Dianne Wiest, respectively. She also brings along her nephew Tyler, who's played by Lucas Hedges, and basically the purpose of bringing him is to kind of keep an eye on the other two women that she brought. Unbeknownst to Alice and the others, also on board is Alice's literary agent, Karen, who's played by Gemma Chan. As the voyage progresses, old grievances come to light, some secrets are revealed, some tensions are explored, and so it becomes kind of a realistic picture of what longtime friendship often turns into. Obviously, as Dianne Wiest is the topic of this episode, she is the reason I gravitated toward this film. I'm also a pretty big fan of Meryl Streep, so it surprised me that my favorite performance was actually that of Candice Bergen. She really held her own against Wiest and Streep, especially there's a scene where she's alone with Meryl Streep's character, and the way they play off each other is just so well done. It doesn't feel like acting at all. It feels like a real conversation. To be honest, I was not all that familiar with Candice Bergen's work before this. All I really remember her from is for hosting Saturday Night Live a few times, and she was always fantastic there, one of my favorite hosts, but she really impressed me here. And of course, Dianne Wiest and Meryl Streep are both wonderfully reliable actresses, so of course they were great too. The main gripe I had while watching this film is that the score doesn't always match what's on screen. For instance, there's a scene where Karen and Alice are just talking to each other and getting to know each other, and the score makes it sound like it's some sort of chase scene. I don't quite understand that decision. My favorite scene is absolutely the one near the end of the film with Candice Bergen and Meryl Streep together. Their chemistry is wonderful. They have a really great, realistic dynamic. You really believe that they are longtime friends and that certain resentments and secrets have been kind of kept under the surface for a while, and they're emerging now and being dealt with. Overall, I would say this experiment was a successful one. Despite the absence of any real action, it's still an interesting film, and Let Them All Talk is well named because that's what Soderbergh did. Let these great actors have conversations, and it's well done. My Letterboxd score for Let Them All Talk is 3.5 out of 5 stars. Next up, we have Not Afraid, Not Afraid. This is a drama from 2001, directed by Annette Carducci. It is not rated, but I would say it would be an R if it were, mostly just for dialogue. The story in Not Afraid, Not Afraid centers around an overbearing psychologist. Paula, who's recently been left by her longtime husband, decides impulsively to kind of go on a tour of her former lovers and see, what they're up to. What Paula doesn't know when she starts out on this trek to visit old flames is that her grandson Thomas, who has Down syndrome, has stowed away in her van. Dianne Wiest tends to be typecast as nurturing mothers, and so to see her here as a decidedly awful mother was a nice change. She also traded in her trademark soft-spoken voice for a huskier one with an English accent. I also enjoyed seeing Jack Davenport, who plays Paula's son Matthew, who was a vicar in the Church of Ireland. You may know him as Norrington from the Pirates of the Caribbean franchise. As someone who is a parent to a disabled person with additional needs, or however they want to phrase it now, it was hard to take a lot of the ableism in the dialogue. In fact, I was kind of concerned about the young man playing Thomas. I hope he was old enough to understand that this was just dialogue in a movie and these people weren't saying these awful things to him. Another thing I found a little challenging was the pacing. I think that stems from this being a European production versus a Hollywood one, so it's just not what I'm used to. So my favorite scene is absolutely Paula and Thomas on the beach. This is where Paula finally bonds with her grandson and he feels safe with her. He falls asleep on her lap and she's just sort of petting his hair and, telling him things while he's asleep. And it's a really sweet scene. It's not done in like a sappy melodramatic fashion. It's more realistic and I really appreciated that. I also enjoyed Thomas's callback to the same and different with the matchsticks. There was an earlier scene with Paula where she was doing kind of an IQ test on Thomas. And he seemed to just be repeating whatever the last thing she said was. So later on, we see him do the matchsticks same and different. And he tells her same, different, and he's right. So basically, the innocent presence of Paula's grandson Thomas helps the family confront some old wounds and work through a few of their issues. We get the idea at the end that some things are never going to change, but Paula has softened somewhat and has bonded with her grandson, whom she had kind of avoided due to ableism. That's really all I have to say about the film. I don't want to give away too much. There actually are a couple of surprises, so I will just leave it there. My Letterboxd score for Not Afraid, Not Afraid was 2 out of 5 stars. The Scout is a sports comedy drama directed by Michael Ritchie. It stars Albert Brooks and Brendan Fraser, with support from Dianne Wiest, of course, and Lane Smith. There are also multiple cameos from Major League Baseball players and the singer Tony Bennett. There are also 2 pretty well-known actors in small roles, Michael Rappaport and J.K. Simmons, the latter of whom is seen quite briefly. The Scout was released in 1994 and was rated PG-13. Al Percolo, who's played by Albert Brooks, is a Major League Baseball scout for the New York Yankees. After a series of failures, he is banished to Mexico by his boss, said boss being played by Lane Smith, who you may know from films like My Cousin Vinny and The Distinguished Gentleman. He was kind of a mainstay in the 90s, so it was nice to see him again here. Anyway, while traveling through Mexico, Al discovers an American baseball player named Steve Nebraska, who is practically worshipped as a god in his little village in Mexico. Steve possesses mythical abilities, including being able to throw a fastball at over 100 miles an hour and hitting a home run every time he steps up to the plate. So after Steve and Al return to New York, it becomes obvious that Steve is struggling with some emotional issues. He's very secretive, and so that starts to be a problem. And he kind of has an outburst at a press conference. And so Al's boss tells him, we're going to have to get this guy evaluated and cleared by a psychiatrist before we can let him play. So Al, being a low-effort sort of gentleman, opens up the yellow pages and calls the first psychiatrist listed, mainly because she was first, but also because her name is Dr. H. Aaron. So Al kind of chuckles to himself and goes, Hammer and Hank, all right. And he calls her. And Dr. Aaron is played by Dianne Wiest. Unfortunately, we're about 45 minutes into the film before she appears. But I understand a foundation kind of had to be laid before her character was introduced. So at that point, the film kind of takes a turn. We'll get to that in a minute. What I like most about this film is the performance of Albert Brooks, to be honest. He was a perfect fit for this character, and he did a remarkable job with it. He actually did co-write the script, so that might be part of why it seemed so natural for him. As for what I didn't like, now you younger folks might not remember this, but there was a time in the 90s where Brendan Fraser was kind of typecast as the lovable oaf, we'll say, characters who are charming but not all that bright. Unfortunately, this is kind of one of those roles. I think The Mummy is what changed that. He got a bit of a respite from it in things like School Ties, but for the most part, yeah, he was kind of the lovable ditzy guy, the airhead, if you will. Sadly, knowing what we know now about Brendan Fraser and his life and career, Hollywood did not treat him kindly in general, but this is just a very mild example. It's part of the reason those of us born in the 1900s are so happy to see him doing well now, because he went through a lot. Another thing I didn't care for is the handling of the subject matter. They treat Steve's mental health concerns as joke fodder, as tension for the story, and it's not explored enough. There needed to be some scenes of him working through things in therapy, not just because I wanted more Dianne Wiest, but because he deserved to develop a bit. There's a scene later on where Dr. Aaron just kind of goes, oh yeah, he's made great progress. And it's like, well, why didn't they show us that? Conversations between them would have been really great. Maybe there's some deleted footage available around. I will choose two favorite scenes. The first is the very opening of the movie, where we kind of establish what Al is like, what his life is like, traveling to motels and having to cook spaghetti on a hot plate and that kind of thing. And when he settles down to watch the original King Kong on TV, his joy in that is just very sweet. It's a great way to introduce the character, so I really enjoyed that opening sequence. Predictably, my favorite scene in the serious part of the film is the introduction of Dr. Aaron. I really wish she had appeared more. But she was great when she was there. Her chemistry with Brendan Fraser was nice, so I really wish they had had more dialogue together. It was just such an uneven film. It started so fanciful with Steve Nebraska being able to do all these things that, you aren't really possible. And then it just kind of dropped off. It just seemed silly to introduce those issues and then just kind of let them lie there. It's just unfortunate. So my Letterboxd score for The Scout is 2.5 out of 5 stars. And finally, we have A Guide to Recognizing Your Saints, which is a coming-of-age film written and directed by Dito Montiel.
My name's Ditto.
based on his memoir of the same name. The film version was released in 2006 and is rated R. Dito, who's sometimes referred to as Ditto just to confuse me, is portrayed by Robert Downey Jr. In the flashbacks to the 1980s when he was growing up, he is played by Shia LaBeouf, so they are the lead actors of this film. There's also a great ensemble cast including Channing Tatum, Dianne Wiest, Chaz Palminteri, and Rosario Dawson. The film explores themes of friendship, family, violence, and family violence, and substance abuse, and in my opinion, it shows mental health struggles and what happens when you take the 1980s approach of just sweeping it under the rug. So, as you may have guessed from that description, this is not a light-hearted film. There are moments of levity here and there, but they are few and far between, and in fact, most of the humor is also mean-spirited, so there's not much of a respite from the drama. There is one character who may be an exception to that, but we'll get to him later. Essentially, Dito,
my name's Ditto,
is living in a very toxic environment, so we don't really blame him when he starts plotting his escape. What I liked most about this film are the performances. This is the kind of movie where the actors kind of make or break it, so kind of a lot of pressure. There's not, explosions or fancy scenery and effects and all that to distract you, so a lot rides on the performances and the dialogue delivery, so I think everyone was pretty well up to the task here. The one who surprised me most, honestly, was Shia LaBeouf. To be frank, I've never been that impressed with him as an actor. To be fair, I haven't seen a ton of his stuff either. A lot was riding on his performance since it is Dito's story.
my name's Ditto.
And, if he hadn't sold it, then everything else kind of would have fallen apart. So he kind of had a lot of pressure on him, and he did great. And I really, really loved Rosario Dawson. I'm hoping there are maybe some deleted scenes with her. I know there is an alternate beginning and end of the film on the DVD, so I'm going to check that out during the editing process, and I will note on the screen if there is any more footage with the adult Laurie. Earlier I mentioned there was one character who was kind of a respite from all the drama and heaviness. His name is Frank the Dog Walker, and he's played by Anthony DeSando. At first, Frank was kind of a comic relief character, kind of a break from all the heavy stuff that was going down. But he became one of the characters going through heavy stuff. So it was kind of a broad range of things to express in one role. So he did a wonderful job here. As for what I didn't like, these characters, some of them are really hard to root for. The young men in this film are a very good example of what the term toxic masculinity actually means. For instance, there is a scene in which one of the characters allows something awful to happen just because he doesn't want to admit that he cares. Now, to be fair, the young women in this story are very off-putting as well. Another thing I didn't care for at first, because it was kind of jarring, were some of the editing choices. In fact, I thought something was wrong with my DVD copy, so I actually pulled the movie up on a streaming service and rewatched the same scene, and it was the same way. So I guess it was done on purpose. As for my favorite scene, I would say anytime the adult Laurie, played by Rosario Dawson, is on screen. She kind of brought up the quality of the whole thing for me. There's also a nice scene between the adult Dito and his mother Flory, who's played by Dianne Wiest. The dynamic between Downey and Wiest is very impressive, very realistic, and their back and forth with each other is just fantastic. Overall, I would say the stories being told in this film are important ones, and they are presumably true ones, as it's based on the writer-director's own memoir. A Guide to Recognizing Your Saints did really well on the film festival circuit. In fact, it won for directing and for acting ensemble at Sundance. My Letterboxd score is 3.5 out of 5 stars. As I've mentioned before, my kind of default score there is 3, so that's pretty good. Thank you for joining me for the Wiest Watchlist Wednesday. I really appreciate you being here. Please like, comment, share, and subscribe. It really helps my channel grow. Take care, and I will see you next time. Bye-bye.